Good morning, students. I am excited because today we're going to start reading our chapter, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It's a personal favorite. I think by the time we get done with it, hopefully before we get done with it, y'all will enjoy it too. Let me start off by letting you know that we are going to be turning in a project. The project will not count on Canvas towards your Del Mar grade, but it will count towards Skyward, your high school grade. And it's just kind of an easy one. Usually we would be doing a booklet, like, fold it hamburger style and have to do a bunch of drawings. But we're not going to do that for this assignment because I don't know if you're going to be able to turn it in to me in person. So these are the things that we're going to be doing that are due at the end of the novel when we're done reading it. You're going to have to give me a title for every chapter. Basically, it's just a summary, like what happens in that chapter that's significant. Because none of the chapters have a title to them. We're going to do vocabulary. We're going to pick 10 words that you don't already know. And you're just going to record them, define them, include the page number. Yeah, that's important. Let's do that. And page number. You found them. And that's going to be worth a couple points. You're going to identify moments of romanticism. This book is kind of a blend of romanticism and realism. Like some terrible things happen to our characters that would happen in real life, but there are some outrageous things that would not happen in reality, and we have to pick those out. You're going to keep a record of the male characters. I was going to do female characters, but then your project would be 100 pages long. There's a lot of female characters, but there's only a few male characters. So we're going to pay attention to how Charlotte Bronte, the author, treats male characters. We're going to keep a record of how Jane changes over time, and this will just be a few sentences here and there. And we're going to keep all of this, or you're going to keep all of this on either a Word or Google document and turn it in at the end of the project, which will be, I don't know how long this is going to take to read this. I just found out that we're going to be off this Friday, so that's good. It's a good Friday. Of course, if you have any questions about the project, we have 4 weeks or more to get this done. So I'm sure there will be changes along the way. Just be flexible and keep up and you should be fine. Okay, let's look at the novel. All right, now in the video on Friday for the lesson, I told you to use the Project Gutenberg ebook of Jane Eyre. It's free and we can use it any way we want to because there's no copyright infringement. I copied and pasted the whole book onto a Google document. It's 460 pages long. That includes the title page, which I'm showing you now, and the preface. First thing to note is Bronte writes Jane Eyre an autobiography, but then it says by Charlotte Bronte. So she is already breaking rules because if it was a true autobiography, it would be called Charlotte Bronte. What she means is she's just being a little tricky. The book is going to be written in the first person, voiced by Jane Eyre. So for Jane Eyre, who is a fictional character, not real, it is an autobiography. But Charlotte Bronte is kind of tricking the reader into thinking that Jane Eyre was a real person and that we're reading about her real life. This is not true. Looks like it was published in 1897. And it starts off with a couple of prefaces because it's been printed several times. Let me get my picture out of here. Okay, and here's the reason why we're using Google Docs. Like, I was reading this preface. You do not have to read the preface, but it's worth giving it a look. Bronte wrote this one. And I like in this paragraph how she thanked the people who were her critics. So I highlighted it and added a comment that she wrote, "Love to the haters. Charlotte thanks the negative critics of her book." So that's a tool we can use thanks to this being on a Word document or a Google document. For instance, like she uses several biblical allusions. Like when she says to pluck the mask from the face of the Pharisee is not to lift an impious hand to the crown of thorns. So like if things like that you notice, you can highlight it and comment on it. Right. And these would just be for your reading notes. Oh, what happened? Oh, there we go. Okay, she does that quite a bit, actually. So when she's talking about her critics, she uses a lot of biblical allusion. She talks about Christ, and later on she refers to some Old Testament stuff. Ahab did not like Micaiah because he never prophesied good concerning him, but evil. Okay, so this shows me that Bronte is well learned when it comes to the Bible. And that's worth noting because this isn't going to be a religious text. At first it seems like it's actually defiant against religion, but then as it goes on, Jane Eyre's attitudes towards religion and Christianity change. So just be ready for that. All right. And then we get to chapter 1. Of course, chapter 1 is not going to remain named chapter 1. You, after you get done reading it, are going to rename it for the project. But let's get started. I'm excited. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. We had been wandering, indeed, in the leafless shrubbery an hour in the morning, but since dinner, Mrs. Reed, when there was no company, dined early. The cold winter wind had brought with its clouds so somber and a rain so penetrating that further outdoor exercise was now out of the question. I was glad of it. I never liked long walks, especially on chilly afternoons. Dreadful to me was the coming home in the raw twilight, with nipped fingers and toes, and a heart saddened by the chidings of Bessie the nurse, and humbled by the consciousness of my physical inferiority to Eliza, John, and Georgiana Reed. All right. Are you baffled already? Well, don't be. It's pretty simple. This is Jane Eyre speaking. So when she says we, she's referring to herself and others. Mrs. Reed we'll get to know soon enough. But she actually says she doesn't like long walks, especially when the weather's bad. So we're getting our, information about the setting. It's cold, it's rainy, and she lives with Eliza, John, and Georgiana Reed. Maybe those are the children of Mrs. Reed. And she speaks of herself as having some kind of physical inferiority to these people. So that speaks to Jane's character. The said Eliza, John, and Georgiana were now clustered round their mamma in the drawing room. She lay reclined on a sofa by the fireside, and with her darlings about her, for the time neither quarrelling nor crying, looked perfectly happy. Me she had dispensed from joining the group, saying, she regretted to be under the necessity of keeping me at a distance, but that until she heard from Bessie, and could discover by her own observation that I was endeavoring in good earnest to acquire a more sociable and childlike disposition, a more attractive and sprightly manner, something lighter, franker, more natural, as it were, she really must exclude me from the privileges intended only for contented, happy little children. Okay, that's interesting. So Mrs. Reed is lying on a sofa with her three children around her, Eliza, John, and Georgiana. But Jane has been dismissed or dispensed until she can be more sociable. So there's already a sense of conflict, and we're just in the third paragraph. Remember Bessie? Who's Bessie? According to this, she is the nurse. So I think we're dealing with a wealthy family here. They can afford to keep a nurse. And Mrs. Reed is able to lie in the middle of the afternoon on a sofa all day while her children play. "What does Bessie say I have done?" I asked. "Jane, I don't like cavaliers or questioners. Besides, there is something truly forbidding in a child taking up elders in that manner. Be seated somewhere, and until you can speak pleasantly, remain silent." A breakfast room adjoined the drawing room. I slipped in there. It contained a bookcase. I soon possessed myself of a volume, taking care that it should be one stored with pictures. I mounted into the window seat. Gathering up my feet, I sat cross-legged like a Turk, and having drawn the red moreen curtain nearly close, I was shrined in double retirement. All right, so she's going to take a book from the bookcase, one with pictures in it. She's going to sit Indian style near the curtain and kind of, distance her from her family and enjoy a book. Folds of scarlet drapery shut in my view to the right hand. To the left were the clear panes of glass, protecting, but not separating me from the drear November day. At intervals, while turning over the leaves of my book, I studied the aspect of that winter afternoon. Afar it offered a pale blank of mist and cloud, near a scene of wet lawn and storm-beat shrub, with ceaseless rain sweeping away wildly before a long and lamentable blast. I returned to my book. Bewick's History of British Birds. The letterpress thereof I cared little for, generally speaking, and yet there were certain introductory pages that, child as I was, I could not pass quite as a blank. They were those which treat of the haunts of seafowl, of the solitary rocks and promontories, by them only inhabited, of the coast of Norway, studded with isles from its southern extremity, the Lindenus, or Naze, to the North Cape, where the northern ocean in vast whirls boils round the naked melancholy isles of farthest Thule, and the Atlantic surge pours in among the stormy Hebrides. Nor could I pass unnoticed the suggestion of the bleak shore of Lapland, Siberia, Spitzbergen, Nova Zembla, Iceland, Greenland, with the vast sweep of the Arctic zone, and those forlorn regions of dreary space, that reservoir of frost and snow, where firm fields of ice, the accumulation of centuries of winters, glazed in alpine heights above heights, surround the pole, and concentre the multiplied rigors of extreme cold. Of these death-white realms I formed an idea of my own, shadowy, like all the half-comprehended notions that float dim through children's brains, but strangely impressive. The words in these introductory pages connected themselves with the succeeding vignettes, and gave significance to the rock standing up alone in a sea of billowy and spray, to the broken boat stranded on a desolate coast, to the cold and ghastly moon glancing through bars of cloud at a wreck just sinking. Okay, hold on. Now, it looks like she's just reading a book, but of course, this is not just any ordinary book. This is Jane Eyre. So what looks like just maybe an atlas that shows the Arctic Ocean and the islands that exist in the Arctic zone, like Greenland and Iceland and Norway, it's still making an impression on our main character here. There's lots of ice and cold, and there's a rock sticking out of these treacherous northern waters that we've read about before, and she's remarking it, so we can't just ignore it. What do we need to know, or what do we need to pull from this? Well, for starters, just remember this. Okay. Water in literature is emotion. Right now, Jane's are cold and icy. Okay, we can definitely dive deeper into that, but just make a note of it, because remember, things that happen at the beginning of books usually come back at the end. Right now, Jane, although it's evident that she's just a young child, she is emotionally in a really cold place. Let's keep reading. I cannot tell what sentiment haunted the quite solitary churchyard, with its inscribed headstone, its gate, its 2 trees, its low horizon, girdled by a broken wall, and its newly risen crescent attesting the hour of eventide. The 2 ships becalmed on a torpid sea, I believe to be marine phantoms. The fiend pinning down the thief's pack behind him, I passed over quickly. It was an object of terror. So was the black horned thing seated aloof on a rock, surveying a distant crowd surrounding a gallows. Each picture told a story, mysterious often to my undeveloped understanding and imperfect feelings, yet ever profoundly interesting as the tales Bessie sometimes narrated on winter evenings, when she chanced to be in good humor, and when, having brought her ironing table to the nursery hearth, she allowed us to sit about, and while she got up Mrs. Reed's lace frills and crimped her nightcap borders, fed our eager attention with passages of love and adventure taken from old fairy tales and other ballads, or, as at a later period I discovered, from the pages of Pamela and Henry, Earl of Morland. Okay, again, we have 2 ships that seem to be at odds, and there's elements of terror. I'm just going to make a note of this quickly and simply. I'm just going to call this foreshadowing. Okay. We've seen in literature before that ships are not ships. They could also be people. And there's going to be 2 people and a torpid sea that are almost phantom-like, with one fiend pinning down the thief's back behind him. Okay, this is foreshadowing of some future conflict between 2 people. Keep that in mind. Also seems that Bessie likes to tell stories at bedtime. With Bewick on my knee, I was then happy at least in my way. I feared nothing but interruption, and that came too soon. The breakfast room door opened. All right, so she's interrupted in her reading. Bewick is a reference to the book she's reading. Who's coming in to disturb her enjoyment of this book? Bo! Madam Mope! Cried the voice of John Reed. Then he paused. He found the room apparently empty. Where the dickens is she? He continued. Lizzie! Georgie! Calling to his sisters. Joan is not here. Tell Mamma she has run out into the rain, bad animal. It is well I drew the curtain, thought I, and wished fervently he might not discover my hiding place. Nor would John Reed have found it out himself. He was not quick either of vision or conception. But Eliza just put her head in at the door and said at once, She is in the window seat, to be sure, Jack. And I came out immediately, for I trembled at the idea of being dragged forth by the said Jack. Oh boy, what a relationship. She fears this Jack character, who's already yelling at her and calling her animal, and he's too dumb to figure out her usual hiding place, but Eliza blows her cover, so she knows she has to come out from behind the curtains or she'll get even worse punishment. What do you want? I asked in awkward diffidence. Say, what do you want, Master Reed? Was the answer. Oh, man. So she's not allowed to call him, she's not allowed to say anything unless he follows it with, or she refers to him as Master Reed. Now, Jack is just a boy at this point. I want you to come here. and seating himself in an armchair, he intimated by a gesture that I was to approach and stand before him. Think of the body language and the positioning here. Who's in the control seat? John Reed was a schoolboy of 14 years old, 4 years older than I. Now we know everybody's age. But as I was but 10, yes, we could do the math, thank you. Large and stout for his age, with a dingy and unwholesome skin, thick lineaments and a spacious visage, heavy limbs and large extremities, he gorged himself habitually at table, which made him bilious. Oh, there's our first vocabulary word right there. I'll just make a note to define that. No, wait, actually, all right, we don't know what this word means, so you can right-click on it and define. And according to this, bilious means affected by or associated with nausea or vomiting. I had eaten something that didn't agree with me, and I was a little bilious. Spiteful, bad-tempered, outburst of bilious misogyny. That describes Jack perfectly, or John Reed perfectly. All right, so let me define it. I guess I'll just copy and paste. I also like this bad-tempered definition. I like both definitions, so I'm going to use both. And add it. There we go. Okay, where was I? And gave him a dim and bleared eye and flabby cheeks. So we have a description of John Reed. He is 14 years old. He's big with heavy limbs, but he's also kind of obese and sickly and blear-eyed with flabby cheeks. So he's big, but not a healthy kind of big. He ought not to have been at school. Oh, wait. He ought now to have been at school. But his mama had taken him home for a month or two, quote, on account of his delicate health, end quote. Mr. Miles, the master, affirmed that he would do very well if he had fewer cakes and sweetmeats sent him from home, but the mother's heart turned from an opinion so harsh and inclined, rather, to the more refined idea that John's sallowness was owing to over-application and perhaps to pining after home. All right, so Jane Eyre, in her description of John Reed, seems to think that he is fat and spoiled. Like he can't even handle school, so he's sent home because he loves mama's, attention and overeating. John had not much affection to his mother and sisters, and an antipathy to me. Antipathy means like not caring. He bullied and punished me, not 2 or 3 times in a week, nor once or twice in a day, but continually. Every nerve I had feared him, and every morsel of flesh in my bones shrank when he came near. There were moments when I was bewildered by the terror he inspired, because I had no appeal whatever against either his menaces or his inflictions. The servants did not like to offend their young master by taking my part against him, and Mrs. Reed was blind and deaf on the subject. She never saw him strike or heard him abuse me, though he did both now and then in her very presence, more frequently, however, behind her back. So John Reed is like a tyrant. He's a villain. He treats Jane awfully. He bullies her, and she hates every moment that he's near. Habitually obedient to John, I came up to his chair. He spent some 3 minutes in thrusting about his tongue at me as far as he could without damaging the roots. What? I knew he would soon strike, and while dreading the blow, I mused on the disgusting and ugly appearance of him who would presently deal it. I wonder if he read that notion in my face, for all at once, without speaking, he struck suddenly and strongly. I tottered, and on regaining my equilibrium, retired back a step or two from his chair. So he hit her? That is awful. Like, she's 10 years old and he's 14 years old and he's allowed to hit her? Or he gets away with it? And they live together? This is uncalled for. I gotta keep reading. That is for your impudence in answering Mama a while since, said he, and for your sneaking way of getting behind curtains, and for the look you had in your eyes 2 minutes since, you rat. Whoa, so he's hit her saying, okay, take that. That's for what you said a little while ago. And that's for hiding behind them curtains. And that's for the way you're looking at me right now. And then he calls her a rat. Accustomed to John Reed's abuse, I never had an idea of replying to it. My care was how to endure the blow which would certainly follow the insult. What were you doing behind the curtain? He asked. I was reading. Show the book. I returned to the window and fetched it thence. You have no business to take our books. You are a dependent, Mamma says. You have no money. Your father left you none. You ought to beg and not to live here with gentlemen's children like us, and eat the same meals we do, and wear clothes at our mamma's expense. Now, I'll teach you to rummage my bookshelves, for they are mine. All the house belongs to me, or will do in a few years. Go and stand by the door, out of the way of the mirror and the windows. Dang. So, John's really letting her have it. This is awful. I did so. Not at first aware what was his intention, but when I saw him lift and poise the book and stand and act to hurl it, I instinctively started aside with a cry of alarm. Not soon enough, however, the volume was flung. It hit me and I fell, striking my head against the door and cutting it. The cut bled. The pain was sharp. My terror had passed its climax. Other feelings succeeded. Wow, he threw a book at her head, and then she hit her head against the door, and now she's cut bleeding. Let's see how she reacts. Wicked and cruel boy, I said. You are like a murderer. You are like a slave driver. You are like the Roman emperors. I had read Goldsmith's History of Rome, and had formed my opinion of Nero, Caligula, etc. Also, I had drawn parallels in silence, which I never thought thus to have declared aloud. What? What? He cried. Did she say that to me? Did you hear her, Eliza and Georgiana? Won't I tell Mamma? But first, he ran headlong at me. I felt him grasp my hair and my shoulder. He had closed with a desperate thing. I really saw him as a tyrant, a murderer. I felt a drop or two of blood from my head trickle down my neck, and was sensible of somewhat pungent suffering. These sensations for the time predominated over fear, and I received him in frantic sort. I don't very well know what I did with my hands, but he called me rat, rat, and bellowed out aloud. Aid was near him. Eliza and Georgiana had run for Mrs. Reed, who was gone upstairs. She now came upon the scene, followed by Bessie and her maid Abbott. We were parted. I heard the words, Dear, dear, what a fury to fly at Master John. Did ever anybody see such a picture of passion? Then Mrs. Reed subjoined, Okay, hold on. The maids are talking about what Jane did to John. Did we actually get a physical description of her out of what she did to him? She says, I don't very well know what I did with my hands, but he called me rat, rat, and bellowed out aloud. And then aid came, and they sympathized with John, not with Jane. Okay. So Jane can't describe what she did. She was like, I guess, lost in the moment. She did something to John. She hit him back. She retaliated against him. And we don't know exactly what she did because she can't tell us. She either has a blackout and did it, unknowingly, or can't remember it. but she obviously hit him in such a way that it affected him greatly. And it's probably going to get her into trouble. There we go. Then Mrs. Reed subjoined, "Take her away to the red room and lock her in there." 4 hands were immediately laid upon me, and I was borne upstairs. So that's the end of chapter 1. So what would you come up for as a title to chapter 1? It seemed interesting. It started off nice enough. It's a rainy November morning. She's enjoying a good book, hiding behind a curtain. And then all of a sudden she's attacked by, I know he's a cousin. John Reed and Georgiana and and what was the other one's name? Eliza are cousins. And Mrs. Reed is the aunt of Jane Eyre. But I don't know how you treat your cousins, but we'd play around, but I would never hit and call them rats. And I never bullied them. I generally loved my cousins. I'm sure you're probably the same way. The relationship that Jane Eyre has with her cousins is not the same as the ones that we have with ours. I got to keep reading. Let's go. It's only been like 40 minutes. All right, chapter 2. I resisted all the way, a new thing for me, and a circumstance which greatly strengthened the bad opinion Bessie and Miss Abbott were disposed to entertain of me. The fact is, I was a trifle beside myself, or rather out of myself, as the French would say. I was conscious that a moment's mutiny had already rendered me liable to strange penalties, and like any other rebel slave, I felt resolved in my desperation to go all lengths. All right, so she's kind of rebelling. She's resisting, whereas in the past she hasn't. Hold her arms, Miss Abbott. She's like a mad cat. For shame, cried the lady's maid. What shocking conduct, Miss Eyre, to strike a young gentleman, your benefactress's son, your young master. Master? How is he my master? Am I a servant? No, you are less than a servant. For you do nothing for your keep. There, sit down and think over your wickedness. Okay, I'm highlighting that. You are less than a servant? That is a servant telling her this. Jane is not just an accepted member of the family. She is considered less than a servant. I guess I could make that a little darker. All right. There, sit down and think over your wickedness. They had got by me this time into the apartment indicated by Mrs. Reed, and had thrust me upon a stool. My impulse was to rise from it like a spring, their 2 pairs of hands arresting me instantly. If you don't sit still, you must be tied down, said Bessie. Miss Abbott, lend me your garters. She would break mine directly. Miss Abbott turned to divest a stout leg of a necessary ligature. This preparation for bonds and the additional ignominy it inferred took a little of the excitement out of me. If y'all don't know what the word ignominy is, you can maybe look that up and make a note of it. Don't take them off, I cried. I will not stir. So the maid was going to take off her garter belt, that thing that goes on her thigh that holds her pantyhose up, and she was going to use that as a rope to tie Jane up before she settles down. In guarantee whereof I attached myself to my seat by my hands. Mind you don't, said Bessie, and when she had ascertained that I was really subsiding, she loosened her hold of me. Then she and Miss Abbott stood with folded arms, looking darkly and doubtfully on my face, as incredulous as my sanity. She never did so before, at last said Bessie, turning to the Abigail. But it was always in her, was the reply. I've told Mrs. often my opinion about the child, and Mrs. agreed with me. She's an underhand little thing. I never saw a girl of her age with so much cover. Bessie answered not, but ere long, addressing me, she said, You ought to be aware, miss, that you are under obligations to Mrs. Reed. She keeps you. If she were to turn you off, you would have to go to the poorhouse. I had nothing to say to these words. They were not new to me. My very first recollections of existence included hints of the same kind. This reproach of my dependence had become a vague sing-song in my ear, very painful and crushing, only half intelligible. Miss Abbott joined in. And you ought not to think of yourself on an equality with the Mrs. Reed and Master Reed, because Mrs. kindly allows you to be brought up with them. They will have a great deal of money, and you will have none. It is your place to be humble, and to try to make yourself agreeable to them. What we tell you is for your good, added Bessie, in no harsh voice. You should try to be useful and pleasant, then, perhaps. You should have a home here. But if you become passionate and rude, Mrs. will send you away, I am sure. Okay, this is not the first or last time we're going to see the word passionate. And the word passionate here does not mean the way we use it now. It's not an episode of The Bachelor or Bachelorette. It means like giving in too easily to your feelings. And I misspelled emotions. Okay, when they call Jane Eyre passionate, it is not a compliment. It means that she cannot control her feelings. Besides, Miss Abbott, said Miss Abbott, God will punish her. Oh boy, it starts already. I'll highlight that. They're already bringing God into it. All right. Think about this. Has Jane done anything wrong? All she was doing was reading a book, peacefully by herself, not bothering anyone. Then she's attacked, and she stands up for herself, and by doing so, she is put down and punished and manhandled or womanhandled and put into like solitary confinement as punishment. And all of this in the name of God, according to the maids. He might strike her dead in the midst of her tantrums. And then where would she go? We know the answer to that. Okay, come, Bessie, we will leave her. I wouldn't have her heart for anything. Say your prayers, Miss Eyre, when you are by yourself. For if you don't repent, something bad might be permitted to come down the chimney and fetch you away. Hey, that's scaring a 10-year-old girl. They went, shutting the door and locking it behind them. The Red Room was a square chamber, very seldom slept in. I might say never, indeed, unless when a chance influx of visitors at Gateshead Hall rendered it necessary to turn to account all the accommodation it contained. Yet it was one of the largest and stateliest chambers in the mansion. A bed supported on massive pillars of mahogany, hung with curtains of deep red damask, stood out like a tabernacle in the center. The two large windows, with their blinds always drawn down, were half shrouded in festoons and falls of similar drapery. The carpet was red. The table at the foot of the bed was covered with a crimson cloth. The walls were a soft fawn color with a blush of pink in it. The wardrobe, the toilet table, the chairs were of darkly polished old mahogany. Out of these deep surrounding shades rose high and glared white the piled-up mattresses and pillows of the bed, spread with a snowy Marseille counterpane. Scarcely less prominent was an ample cushioned easy-chair near the head of the bed, also white, with a footstool before it, and looking, as I thought, like a pale throne. That's a lot of good description there. Good writing, Charlotte. This room was chill, because it seldom had a fire. It was silent because remote from the nursery and kitchen, solemn because it was known to be so seldom entered. The housemaid alone came here on Saturdays to wipe from the mirrors and the furniture a week's quiet dust, and Mrs. Reed herself, at far intervals, visited it to review the contents of a certain secret drawer in the wardrobe, where were stored divers parchments, her jewel casket, and a miniature of her deceased husband. In those last words lies the secret of the Red Room, the spell which kept it so lonely in spite of its grandeur. Mr. Reed had been dead 9 years. Okay, easy math. Jane is 10 years old. Mr. Reed has been dead 9 years. It was in this chamber he breathed his last. Here he lay in state. Hence his coffin was borne by the undertaker's men, and since that day a sense of dreary consecration had guarded it from frequent intrusion. My seat, to which Bessie and the bitter Miss Abbott had left me riveted, was a low ottoman near the marble chimney-piece. The bed rose before me. To my right hand, lost place. There was a high, dark wardrobe with subdued, broken reflections, varying the gloss of its panels. To my left were the muffled windows. A great looking-glass between them repeated the vacant majesty of the bed and room. I was not quite sure whether they had locked the room, or when I dared move, I got up and went to see. Alas, yes, no jail was ever more secure. Returning, I had to cross before the looking-glass. My fascinated glance involuntarily explored the depth it revealed. All looked colder and darker in that visionary hollow than in reality. And the strange little figure there gazing at me, with a white face and arms specking the gloom, and glittering eyes of fear moving where all else was still, had the effect of a real spirit. Here she's looking at herself and kind of spooking herself. I thought it like one of the tiny phantoms, half fairy, half imp. Bessie's evening stories represented as coming out of lone, ferny dells and moors, and appearing before the eyes of belated travelers. I returned to my stool. That's interesting. She kind of sees herself as an imp, a strange little figure. Okay, so she's scared of her own reflection. She has been conditioned by the maids that she is a bad person, and she has been told ghost stories. She's blending them together. Okay, so, yeah, like Jane's kind of been conditioned to think of herself as a bad person because she acts like a normal child and gets grumpy and stands up for herself and hits back when she gets hit. And because of these reasons, because she's poor and because her parents are dead, spoiler alert, sorry, that she's treated like less than a human being. And so she's starting to, there's a brief moment where she thinks of herself as less than a human being. Okay, superstition was with me at that moment, but it was not yet her hour for complete victory. My blood was still warm. The mood of the revolted slave was still bracing me with its bitter vigor. I had to stem a rapid rush of retrospective thought before I quailed to the dismal present. Okay, so she's still calming down from the anger she felt from being bullied and getting punished. But she's also starting to get scared by all the old ghost stories she's been told. And the fact that she's in the room with a guy that's been dead for 9 years. He's not in the room, he's gone. But, the spirit remains. All John Reed's violent tyrannies, all his sister's proud indifference, all his mother's aversion, all the servants' partiality, turned up in my disturbed mind like a dark deposit in a turbid well. Why was I always suffering, always browbeaten, always accused, forever condemned? Why could I never please? Why was it useless to try to win anyone's favor? Eliza, who was headstrong and selfish, was respected. Georgiana, who had a spoiled temper, a very acrid spite, a captious and insolent carriage, was universally indulged. Her beauty, her pink cheeks, and her golden curls seemed to give delight to all who looked at her, and to purchase indemnity for every fault. John no one thwarted, much less punished, though he twisted the necks of the pigeons, killed the little pea-chicks, set the dogs at the sheep, stripped the hothouse vines of their fruit, and broke the buds off the choicest plants of the conservatory. He called his mother old girl, too, sometimes reviled her for her dark skin, similar to his own, bluntly disregarded her wishes, not unfrequently tore and spoiled her silk attire, and he was still of her own darling. I dared commit no fault. I strove to fulfill every duty, and I was termed naughty and tiresome, sullen and sneaking, from morning to noon, and from noon to night. Okay, so in this paragraph, she does a good job of explaining the relationship she has with her cousins and her aunt. And boy, John gets the worst of the description. He is described as having the kind of characteristics that a psychopath might have, like as a child killing animals, little innocent animals. And we know how those guys turn out. But also the daughters, the female cousins, aren't too much better. They're indifferent. They're disrespectful. They look down on Jane. Eliza's headstrong but still respected. Georgiana is pretty and spoiled, but they're treated well, whereas Jane is not. My head still ached and bled with the blow and fall I had received. No one had reproved John for wantonly striking me, and because I had turned against him to avert farther irrational violence, I was loaded with general opprobrium. Unjust, unjust, said my reason, forced by the agonizing stimulus into precocious though transitory power and resolve, equally wrought up, instigated some strange expedient to achieve escape from insupportable oppression, as running away, or if that could not be effected, never eating or drinking more, and letting myself die. What a consternation of soul was mine that dreary afternoon, how all my brain was in tumult, and all my heart in insurrection. Yet in what darkness, what dense ignorance was the mental battle fought. I could not answer the ceaseless inward question, why I thus suffered. Now, at the distance of, I will not say how many years, I see it clearly. Okay, so she's referring to, when she's writing her autobiography, she's looking back on this, and at the time she was wondering why, but she's not going to tell you how old she is now when she's writing this. I was a discord in Gateshead Hall. I was nobody there. I had nothing in harmony with Mrs. Reed or her children, or her chosen vassalage. If they did not love me, in fact, as little did I love them. They were not bound to regard with affection a thing that could not sympathize with one amongst them, a heterogeneous thing, opposed to them in temperament, in capacity, in propensities, a useless thing, incapable of serving their interest, or adding to their pleasure, a noxious thing, cherishing the germ of indignation at their treatment, of contempt of their judgment. I know that I had been a sanguine, brilliant, careless, exacting, handsome, romping child. Though equally dependent and friendless, Mrs. Reed would have endured my presence more complacently. Her children would have entertained for me more of the cordiality of fellow feeling. The servants would have been less prone to make me the scapegoat of the nursery. In other words, she's kind of like, as an adult writing this, she understands why she was so upset as a child, but now she, as an adult, can understand, like, it was a difficult situation to be in. Mrs. Reed and her children didn't value Jane because she didn't bring anything to the table. There was nothing that she offered. All she was going to do was, be a burden to them. And so that's how they treated her. Okay, there was one thing that I wanted to point to. When John was talking about, there it is. John Reed would put down his own mother and talk about her dark skin. Let me just highlight that. If you're thinking in terms of race, then that's good that your brain's working. Just make a note that dark skin was used to describe Mrs. Reed, it's going to come up again. She's not of African descent, but like compared to a pale, pasty English person, she's a little bit more tan than your typical Englishman. But don't think I didn't think about that. All right. Back to the novel. Daylight began to forsake the Red Room. It was past 4 o'clock, and the beclouded afternoon was tending to drear twilight. I heard the rain still beating continuously on the staircase window, and the wind howling in the grove behind the hall. I grew by degrees cold as a stone, and then my courage sank. My habitual mood of humiliation, self-doubt, forlorn depression fell damp on the embers of my decaying ire. All said I was wicked, and perhaps I might be so. What thought had I been but just conceiving of starving myself to death? That certainly was a crime, and was I fit to die? Or was the vault under the chancel of Gateshead Church an inviting bourne? In such vault, I had been told, did Mr. Reed lie buried, and led by his thought to recall his idea, I dwelt on it with gathering dread. I could not remember him, but I knew that he was my own uncle, my mother's brother. More familial background information. Why can't my mouse control itself? Okay, so Mr. Reed is related to Jane because he's her biological uncle. That means Mrs. Reed is no relation to Jane. Mr. Reed's sister is Jane's mother. So Mr. Reed would have had more of an emotional attachment to Jane because it's the daughter of his sister. Whereas Mrs. Reed, the widow of Mr. Reed, isn't biologically related to Jane. Now the cousins are, because the cousins are Mr. Reed's children. But Mrs. Reed, that kind of explains why Mrs. Reed is colder towards Jane. She's not of her own family tree, so to speak. That had taken me when a parentless infant to his house, and that in his last moments he had aspired a promise of Mrs. Reed that she would rear and maintain me as one of her own children. Mrs. Reed probably considered she had kept this promise, and so she had, I dare say, as well as her nature would permit her. But how could she really like an interloper not of her race, and unconnected with her, after her husband's death by any tie? It must have been most irksome to find herself bound by a hard-wrung pledge to stand in the stead of a parent to a strange child she could not love, and to see an uncongenial alien permanently intruded on her own family group. Okay, so Jane as an adult can understand why Mrs. Reed was distant or mean or cold to her. Like she had made a promise just 1 year into the adoption, her husband dies. And he, on his deathbed, he makes her promise that she'll take care of Jane. And as far as Mrs. Reed is concerned, she is doing the best she can. Okay, a singular notion dawned upon me. I doubted not, never doubted, that if Mr. Reed had been alive, he would have treated me kindly. And now, as I sat looking at the white bed and overshadowed walls, occasionally also turning a fascinated eye towards the dimly gleaming mirror, I began to recall that I had heard of dead men troubled in their graves by the violation of their last wishes, visiting the earth to punish the perjured and avenge the oppressed, and I thought Mr. Reed's spirit, harassed by the wrongs of his sister's child, might quit its abode, whether in the church vault or in the unknown world of the departed, and rise before me in this chamber. Notice the use of dash, by the way. I love how Charlotte's not afraid to use a dash. She uses them all over the place. Take note. I wiped my tears and hushed my sobs, fearful lest any sign of violent grief might waken a preternatural voice to comfort me, or elicit from the gloom some hallowed face. By the way, the word preternatural simply means supernatural. Like, oh, I don't know, a ghost would be considered supernatural. Even if you believe in ghosts, like, they're hard to prove that they actually exist, so they're not considered reality. Predator and supernatural mean the same thing. This idea, consolatory in theory, I felt would be terrible if realized. With all my might, I endeavored to stifle it. I endeavored to be firm. Shaking my hair from my eyes, I lifted my head and tried to look boldly around the dark room. At this moment, a light gleamed on the wall. Was it, I asked myself, a ray from the moon penetrating some aperture in the blind? No, moonlight was still. And this stirred while I gazed. It glided up to the ceiling and quivered over my head. I can now conjecture readily that this streak of light was, in all likelihood, a gleam from a lantern carried by some one across the lawn. But then, prepared as my mind was for horror, shaken as my nerves were by agitation, I thought the swift darting beam was a herald of some coming vision from another world. My heart beat thick. My head grew hot. A sound filled my ears, which I deemed the rushing of wings. Something seemed near me. I was oppressed, suffocated. Endurance broke down. I rushed to the door and shook the lock in desperate effort. Steps came running along the outer passage. The key turned. Bessie and Abbott entered. Miss Eyre, are you ill?" said Bessie. "What a dreadful noise! It went quite through me," exclaimed Abbott. "Take me out! Let me go into the nursery," was my cry. "What for? Are you hurt? Have you seen something?" again demanded Bessie. "Oh, I saw a light, and I thought a ghost would come." I had now got hold of Bessie's hand, and she did not snatch it from me. "She has screamed out on purpose," declared Abbott. "She has screamed out on purpose," declared Abbott in some disgust. And what a scream! If she had been in great pain, one would have excused it. But she only wanted to bring us all here. I know her naughty tricks. Boy, Miss Abbott's cold. "What is all this?" demanded another voice peremptorily. And Mrs. Reed came along the corridor, her cap flying wide, her gown rustling stormily. "Abbott and Bessie, I believe I gave orders that Jane should be left in the red room till I came to her myself." "Miss Jane screamed so loud, ma'am," pleaded Bessie. "Let her go," was the only answer. Loose Bessie's hand, child. You cannot succeed in getting out by these means, be assured. I abhor artifice, particularly in children. It is my duty to show you that tricks will not answer. You will now stay here an hour longer, and it is only on condition of perfect submission and stillness that I shall liberate you then." "Oh, aunt, have pity! Forgive me! I cannot endure it! Let me be punished some other way. I shall be killed if—" "Silence! This violence is almost repulsive, and so no doubt she felt it. I was a precocious actress in her eyes. She sincerely looked on me as a compound of virulent passions, mean spirit, and dangerous duplicity." Bessie and Abbott having retreated, Mrs. Reed, impatient of my now frantic anguish and wild sobs, abruptly thrust me back and locked me in, without farther parley. I heard her sweeping away, and soon after she was gone. I suppose I had a species of fit, unconscious closed the scene. Okay, that ends chapter 2, and we've almost read for an hour, so this is going fantastically. Okay, just to give you guys a start, I'm not going to do every chapter for you, but just to get you started on your project, let's go back to the project page. And one thing that you were asked to do is a title for each chapter, and that's worth 25 points. So let's give this like an A or something. All right, chapter 1. We need a title. It could be something simple like Jane gets treated unfairly by John Reed. Or it could be something like Jane gets hit in the head with a book. Chapter 2. Jane thinks she sees a ghost. Or how about Jane goes to the red room? A very ominous, scary room for a 10-year-old little girl who is raised on ghost stories, an orphan in a home that she's hated in. All right, I am intrigued. This book is gripping. I love it so far. I hope you're enjoying it too. I can't wait to find out what happens tomorrow. If you want to keep reading, go ahead. And I will see you later. Bye.